Hello everyone, it's Oblitter here, and today I have another full throttle drift tutorial for you. Just like last time, I'm going to be using the Chevrolet Corvette ZR1 because it's my second favorite car of all time. And well, this time I'm not really going to be explaining how to set up drift cars and all that. I'm really just going to go into what you should be doing to drift in full throttle. So without further ado, let's get right into it, shall we? First off, I recommend staying in manual when drifting in full throttle, because most cars drift better when they stay in a certain gear. For example, if you're doing these short drifts in the city, the second gear is usually the best one to use. If you're going for a longer drift, the third gear works best. The handbrake locks your rear tires. Tapping this will usually help you lose traction and start a drift in this case. And finally, counter steering, probably the most important part of all. Simply you steer in the opposite way your car is going so that your car does not spin out. I'm going to have a few keys in the top left corner to kind of show you what buttons I press at certain times. When they are red, it means they are being pushed down. When they are white, it means they are not being pressed. Well, that is pretty much the easiest way you can drift in full throttle. Just stay in second gear and drive on these narrow city streets. Of course, it's not as fast or as flashy as drifting around, let's say, a hairpin, so I'm going to show you that next. Welcome to Mount Hairy, and yes, this is what this mountain pass is actually called in-game. This here is the only mountain pass in full throttle so far. It's not the largest mountain pass, it only has 2 hairpins and 3 regular turns, but it is still my favorite place to drift. If you have trouble drifting here, don't be afraid to ask around, because I'm not the only one drifting here. There is a drift group for this game, and they are called the Horizon Chasers. They drift on Mount Hairy quite often. I recommend practicing with this hairpin here first. Now the reason for that is if you drive to this hairpin from the top here, the road is flat. That helps because if you're going uphill or downhill, your car behaves differently, and I'll get into that later. But for now, we're going to go drift a hairpin. I personally find drifting around hairpins much more fun than drifting around the 90-degree turns in the city. Usually you want to come in at around 100 miles per hour, since, well, I'm just saying what I do. And in my Corvette, I come in third gear. So I'm going to go drift around the hairpin right now. Since you are drifting around a hairpin, you're going to want to hold the drift for longer. So instead of simply counter steering all the way, you're going to want to kind of let off the counter steer when your car is about to straighten, and only hold the counter steer and straighten your car once you reach the end of the turn. If these clips with the keyboard keys are going too fast for you, then you can always slow it down by selecting the YouTube speed. Now, most people end up spinning out because they don't counter steer quick enough, but it's also because they're on a mountain. Now, I'm going to explain how the mountain affects your driving. To put it simply, your car behaves differently when you are going uphill or going downhill. I'm going to park my Corvette facing downhill, and you're going to see in a moment what I mean. There we go. So as you can see, the front end is kind of lifted off the ground now, while the rear is still being pushed down. This is the opposite of what would happen in real life because in Full Throttle there is a gyro for all the cars that tries to keep the car upright at all times. This means is that driving downhill is more like driving uphill in this game, and driving uphill is more like driving downhill. Now, because the front end is kind of lifted now, the front tires aren't coming into contact with the ground as much as it normally would. This means the car is going to understeer when driving downhill, and this catches a lot of people off guard when they try to drift on the mountain pass. This is what happens if you try to drift the hairpin normally going downhill. Now let's see that again. Basically what happens here is, as the car is coming in, I hit the handbrake as I normally would and steered in the right direction. But because the car was going downhill and the front tires were kind of lifted, the car didn't steer quite as much as it normally would and ended up gripping the turn and losing traction halfway through the hairpin. That is more of a power slide than a drift. This is the line that the Corvette was forced to take because its front tires were lifted and it was understeering. This green line is what it should be doing. To adjust to the downhill, simply enter a drift at a higher speed using the handbrake a bit more than you normally would, and countersteer as soon as the ground levels out. Alright, now we are facing the uphill. On the uphill, the rear tires are the ones being lifted up, and the front tires are the ones being pushed down. Once again, this is what would happen on a downhill in real life, but this is Full Throttle, and it's kind of the opposite here. Basically, this catches a lot of people off guard, especially when they drive a rear-wheel drive drift car for the first time, because they realize that all of a sudden they can't drive straight going uphill anymore. Watch what happens if I try to drive uphill and I just, without even using the handbrake, try to turn. If you don't want this to happen, then simply don't press W while pressing A or D while driving uphill in a drift car. As for drifting a hairpin while going uphill, it's pretty much the same as drifting a hairpin normally, just you definitely want to let go of W while turning, otherwise you're going to spin out completely, and you want to countersteer the moment you reach the turn, or the moment you let go of space. Alright, that is pretty much it. There is one last thing I want to note, and that is that drifting is not as fast as grip racing will be. As you can see here, this is much quicker than drifting ever is in Full Throttle. But drifting is just much more fun, to me at least. And it's kind of like what figure skating is compared to speed skating. It's really just something that's nice to look at, and it still requires a lot of skill to do. And I also really like how in Full Throttle they didn't make it so that you just press one button and you drift perfectly. You really need to countersteer, watch your revs, all that stuff. In fact, I don't know if this video will get anyone to drift perfectly, but I think it's kind of more providing an example to follow with the buttons and the drifts that I did. And if you can't drift right away, don't get discouraged. A lot of guys, including me, took quite a while to get used to drifting as well. I took a week, and I know some guys in the Horizon Chasers who took over a month. So, just keep practicing, that's all I can say. Matter of fact, I keep practicing both drifting and grip racing. So, without further ado, that'll be all for this video. Obblitter checking out.